I mention you today, particularly, though, to give you a little bit of a warning to brace yourself for my opening statement in the festival today for this particular sermon. My opening statement is this. The Feast of Tabernacles does not picture the millennium. Now, I have explained it year after year, many years ago, that it did. And I want to be very clear as I make this statement, it doesn't. Now, there is a way of explaining it that way. I understand that fully. But I want to give you the Sabbath morning cup of coffee challenge. Some Sabbath morning, get your Bible, your Cruden's Concordance, or perhaps your Strong's Concordance, a cup of coffee or whatever beverage you enjoy, non-adult beverage you enjoy on a Sabbath morning. Put your feet up and study your way through, using your marginal references and anything else you can do to find your way through the subject, the Feast of Tabernacles, the idea of tabernacles, the idea of tenting, or the words booth, tabernacles, tent, so that you can find your way through all the references that have to do with the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, you'll run down a lot of blind alleys, and you'll run across a lot of strange things that may not have a lot to do with it, but you'll find it a useful Bible study, and I can say that you will almost certainly come to a different conclusion about the Feast of Tabernacles than the idea that we used to teach, that it, quote, pictured the millennium. Now, let me show you what I mean by this. I'll give you a hint, a starting place to work on this in Leviticus 23. Leviticus 23 is where we always turn to, because this is where all the holy days are laid out, front to back. Now, I want to say to start with that I am profoundly indebted to Herbert W. Armstrong, the Worldwide Church of God in years gone by, for helping me to understand that these holy days ought to be kept, and that they pictured the plan of God, that they are a part of a revealing of the plan of God. For one thing, it was a little bit of a revelation to me to come to understand that God had a plan at all. I don't suppose it should have been, but it seemed to be that He actually had something in mind. He was going somewhere, had an objective, and was working out something. And the Feast of Tabernacles, among other holy days, were a revelation to me and to us of what that plan was. And so annually, because all of us in the ministry were urged to speak on the meaning of the day on the day, I always tried to do that, and have tried to do so now for I was speaking as early as 1961. I think my first sermon probably was given along about 1960 or 1961 in the Worldwide Church of God. And so from that time to this, every time I come to a holy day, I try to speak about what the holy day is all about. Well, we had a set of approved meanings, as it were. The divine revelation had been handed down. And when you have found the truth, and you have got the truth, there's no point in continuing to look for the truth, is there? But our problem was that there is a presumption that sometimes we make that is a little bit vain on our part, that we already got all of the truth and that there is not more to it, or that we may not have something wrong. Well, over the years, in the process of flipping my Bible open and getting my concordance out, in more recent years, booting my computer up, getting the Bible program fired up, and beginning to look for scriptures and follow up the meanings of words as I'm able to do now, and with the speed that we're able to do it now, I began to run into trouble on some of these holy days, according to the meaning of the days that we had all were sort of divinely approved, as it were, and we had them all written down in the inspired margins of our Bibles where we had written them. I kept running into difficulties, and I've run into difficulties with virtually all of them in one way or another, and I came to understand that the depth of the holy days, of what they mean, and of the typology. Now, typology is a fancy word for symbolism. It means that there are models or types that exist in the Bible which picture something else for us and help us to understand some other aspect of these things. And so you try to chase these things down, and there is a depth to them that had been for me, I think, previously unappreciated, and we just keep on expanding, and pushing back the edges of our understanding into these areas with every year that passes. So as we preach them, especially if we are able to approach them freely and with an open mind and without having our minds completely made up on some of these things, the things that begin to appear to us and occur to us from them are remarkable indeed. Well, here in Leviticus 23, all of them are laid out, and we have followed through the pattern of the annual holy days, trying to understand what do they mean. What did they mean to Israel? What do they mean to Christians? What are they relative to God's great plan that He is working out here on this earth? Well, in Leviticus 23, the commandment concerning the Feast of Tabernacles begins in verse 33. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, The 15th day of the 7th month shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days unto the Lord. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no servile work therein. The distinction between servile and all work is that the work of preparing food may be done on a holy day because it's a feast. 7 days you shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord. On the 8th day there shall be a holy convocation. You shall offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. It's a solemn assembly. You'll do no servile work therein. So there we go. We got 7 days for the Feast of Tabernacles, and we got an 8th day, which means something a little bit apart from the Feast of Tabernacles. But we have this all laid out for us here. The interesting part, though, begins in verse 39. Also in the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the fruit of the land, you shall keep a feast of the Lord 7 days. The first day will be a Sabbath, the 8th day will be a Sabbath. And you shall take to you on the first day the boughs of goodly trees, branches of palm trees, boughs of thick trees, willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. Now, how do you go about rejoicing with a palm branch? You know, wave it, jump up and down on it. What do you do with it? Well, it's kind of you have to study the matter a little bit to come to understand fully. But what's involved with it is taking the branches and boughs of trees and palm trees and making for yourself a small hooch, as it were, a hut, a booth, or a tabernacle. In my youth, I remember going to church in what was called a brush arbor. And I think the old brush arbor came from this particular passage of Scripture. And when the harvest was in the autumn in the farming countries of Arkansas, Oklahoma, and this part of the country right here, well, the preacher would come through, and sometimes he'd be a circuit rider, and they'd go out and they'd build a little shade thing with poles on the corners and poles across the top, and put branches and so forth over the top of it so that it would shelter the thing from the sun, and it'd be a cool place to meet for having their camp meetings or their tent meetings, all of which probably really the ideas originated with the Feast of Tabernacles. They tended to take place in the fall when the farmers had finished their work. It's so you've got your fruit in, you've got all the work done. Let's get together and worship God, seems to have been the idea. And it found its way into this country, and in Southern Protestantism at least, down into our own century today. I imagine it's probably been a while since anybody has built a brush arbor. But I can remember going to one and being rather amused as a young man, watching all the people at the different times of services. They would all kneel around the benches that were there and all pray out loud at the same time. And it was really a really strange circumstance, but these people were having a wonderful time worshiping and praying to God. Anyway, he says, you shall keep it a feast of the Lord 7 days in a year. It shall be a statute forever in your generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. You shall dwell in booths, huts, tabernacles, tents, whatever you want to call them, for 7 days. All that are Israelite born shall dwell in booths. Now, why? Here's the answer. That your generations may know that I made the children of Israel to dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Now, there are two troubling questions in this passage. One of them is the statement, you shall dwell in booths 7 days. All that are Israelite born will dwell in booths. Now, if you've had much in the way of argumentation with people about the holy days, they'll come to this right away and they'll say, hey, this is for the Jews. This is just for the Israelites of old. It has nothing to do with Gentiles, and I'm a Gentile. I don't have to keep the Feast of Tabernacles, and therefore this doesn't have anything to do with me. That's question number one. The other question is, what is the typology of this thing? In other words, what does its symbolism mean? Well, we read that it means that your generations may know that I made the children of Israel to dwell in booths when I brought them out of the land of Egypt. So it really comes across as a national holiday, a national observance to remind people of something that took place in their history of old. However, there is more to this than meets the eye, as I will shortly explain. My sister and I were talking not long ago. I had occasion to go back by her home, and my mother died over a year ago now, I think, and my sister had finally had time to put together all the pictures and the memorabilia, and she had a box prepared for me of some of the things. She still hasn't gone through it all, of mementos that my mother had saved that she thought that I would like to have. And among those was a little cassette tape of an old album that my father had kept of the Statesman Quartet. Now, for those of you who haven't heard this before, I'll remind you, the rest, that my father used to sing in a gospel quartet. He sang in the Arkansas Stamps Quartet for a while and the Vaughn Brothers Quartet out of Siloam Springs, Arkansas. They had a daily radio program, and then on the weekends, they would get in their car and they would come off across Oklahoma and Arkansas, all through this country out through here. And they would go to a little schoolhouse, and they would go in on a Saturday night and hold a big concert right there, a big singing convention, as it were. And they had a show that would, a real show. I mean, they did the whole thing from beginning to end. They had one of them, the tenor, and my dad's quartet was quite a comedian, and he would put on a kind of a clown suit, come out and tell old country jokes that everybody had heard before but laughed at anyway. And this was the way these things were done. But my sister was reminding me as we talked about this, that both of us, really, our earliest religious experiences were musical. That our earliest learnings about God, that He was, that He existed, that He acted in the affairs of man, came in little schoolhouses, probably while we were lying on a pallet on the floor, or maybe sitting up in a chair just kind of watching and listening and learning, and watching Dad perform. These were where our earliest ideas about God began to be formulated. And it was striking to me to consider the fact that enormous amount of the ideas that I hold today to be true, I heard in gospel songs, 50 years ago and more, 50 and 55 years ago, at the feet of my father. Because my father not only sang in the conventions, he sang in the shower, he sang in the bathtub, he sang in the house, he sang in the kitchen, he sang in the car going down the road, and I sang with him. And the singing was a very important part of our lives. Now, what I have in years to follow have come to realize is that a lot of those old gospel songwriters, while they were not the least bit theologically astute, in other words, the depth of their theological understanding was rather limited. They understood it at a certain level. But they really didn't go into a lot of the depths of things that people are prone to want to argue about. But what I was struck by was the fact that so many of these people had read their Bible. They had read the Bible, and they had found in the Bible the only hope that they had been able to find anywhere. And you also will hear a lot of this in Negro spirituals, because these people who in their earliest times were slaves in this country found a very strong identity with the slaves who were in Egypt, the Israelites who were in slavery in Egypt, and consequently a lot of their music reflects the whole sequence of events from the captivity in Egypt to the Exodus, to the crossing of the Red Sea. Moses is a big factor in their hymnology, because Moses was the great deliverer, the one that brought them out of Egypt and was going to take them on toward the Promised Land. Joshua was a big man in their hymnology, because Joshua was the one who took Israelites into the Promised Land. And I began to realize that in this whole pattern from the captivity in Egypt to the crossing of Jordan and entering into the Promised Land is the pattern of the holy days. It is the pattern of the plan of God. It is the pattern of salvation. And this is known, folks, by ignorant country backwoods songwriters from years ago, from old black preachers who years and years ago were barely able to read the Bible, and that's all they read. And in reading the Bible, they found out that there was sin, and that sin led one into captivity, and that sin was the thing that led to slavery, and slavery is what we all wanted to get out of, and so on it went with the development of the themes of the songs. And so it was that we came to understand, and I began to grasp in little bits and pieces as a boy, what I later on came to understand in considerably greater depth, that Egypt of old is a type of sin. That Israel was sold into sin, sold into captivity, and enslaved by sin. And there is no harsher taskmaster than sin. There is nothing that is more likely to dominate and control your life than sin. There is nothing more likely to oppress you than sin and to destroy your life, to destroy your heart, your soul, your very reason for being than sin. And there's no way out of sin once you're there. You are handcuffed, shackled, locked up, sealed. You have to have a deliverer. And God sent Moses, who was a type of Christ, and said to old Pharaoh, as the song says, "Go down, Moses, tell old Pharaoh, let my people go." Simple theology? What could be simpler? But the deliverer comes, says, let them go. And through the death of the firstborn, they were let go. The shackles of sin was broken. Israel was set free, and they started out across the desert with sin dogging their steps every step of the way. And they came to where they were trapped with the Red Sea in front of them and the devil behind them, as it were. Sin, that type that has brought us to the old between the devil and the deep blue sea. With Pharaoh behind and the sea in front, Moses stretches out his arms over the sea. It goes back by a great wind all night, and they walk across the dry shod across the bottom of the Red Sea. And as one New Testament writer, Paul, puts it, they were baptized in the Red Sea. And so that the symbolism of the deliverance from sin, the going out of sin and getting away from captivity and being set free from it all, goes right through the waters of baptism and out the other side into the Sinai Peninsula, into the wilderness where they wandered for 40 years, just like most of us do. Wandering around, who, when we might have taken the short route, inevitably seem to take the long route to wherever it is we're going to go. Why do we do it? Because of a lack of faith, because of unbelief. The same reasons that Israel had to wander for 40 years in the wilderness instead of only maybe one while they made their way straight up and into the Promised Land. All these patterns of things, just all of them are the plan of salvation, and all of them just walk right alongside of the holy days and their revelations to man. And then we come, at the end of 40 years, to the Jordan River. And the Jordan River is one of the really dominant themes in old gospel hymnology. Because the Jordan is the symbol of the great transition from this life to the next life, from this world to the next world, from this world into the Promised Land. We have in our own hymnal a grand old hymn that starts off by saying, "On Jordan's stormy banks I stand, and cast a wishful eye to Canaan's fair and happy land, where my possessions lie." And the chorus is, "I am bound for the Promised Land, I am bound for the Promised Land. Oh, who will come and go with me? I'm bound for the Promised Land." Great old hymn. Somebody way back when understood this. That we're strangers, that we're pilgrims, that we're wandering around in the wilderness, and I want to cross Jordan into the Promised Land, where you have to have two men to carry a bundle of grapes between them on a staff. That's where I want to be. And so the imagery that was developed of the transition from here to there. And I can remember one of my dad's favorite solos that he did in concert, because each one of the men got featured in something. And one of his favorites was the one about, the title of it was, "I Won't Have to Cross Jordan Alone. When I come to the river at ending of day, when the last winds of sorrow have blown, there'll be somebody waiting to show me the way. I won't have to cross Jordan alone." Beautiful old song. Simple, down to earth. They thought, people who sang it were thinking about dying and going to heaven, I'll grant you that. But nevertheless, the idea that we have to make a transition, that we are not home, that we are not permanent, that this is the time when we are transitory and we must cross into the Promised Land and make that transition, was very dominant in the hymns and the songs that they went through. Now, I think, all this is there, and we have seen it in our lifetime as we study through hymns, as we work our way through the holy days. Now, what is also clear when you get through with this is that the Feast of Tabernacles, since it pictures dwelling in booths when you came out of Egypt and not being at home, takes place on this side of Jordan, not on the other side of Jordan. It's not the millennium. It's not the kingdom. It's not being there. It's being here. It's being temporary. It's living under a brush arbor, where it's fine when the sun is shining and it keeps the hot sun off of you. But when it starts raining, it gets kind of miserable under a brush arbor. It's not a place you particularly want to be. It doesn't keep out the rain. It doesn't handle wind very well. A lot of things that aren't good about it. But we've come to see, really, that the old formula of tabernacles equals the kingdom doesn't fit the pattern that we find in the Bible. What it does fit is the time of the temporary wandering in the wilderness that all of us are going through in our lives right here, right now, when we go through it. Now, consider the other question that I raised. The statement that is made, all who are Israelite born will keep the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days. They'll dwell in booths for 7 days. Something crystallized for me just in the past year. It wasn't that I hadn't had any idea of it before, but I was engaged in a debate on one of the computer online services with some people who are of the Worldwide Church of God's New Understanding. New Understanding, they abbreviate that to NU nowadays. The NU, NCNU is New Covenant, New Understanding, among the people who talk about this. And this fellow was making a great deal of the fact that when you look at the Sabbath commandment, because the Sabbath was the big subject, the big object, and the focal point of all of the debate that began to take place along about January, February, March of this year. he was making a great deal out of the fact that the Sabbath was an old covenant institution, and that it was given to Israel, and that it had strictly old covenant implications. And he cited in particular the fact that the commandment to keep the Sabbath was different in Deuteronomy 5 from what it was in Exodus 20. And I don't remember the particular line of argument that was developed along this type of thing. I was just struck by it, and it stopped me dead in my tracks, and I began to think about a sequence began to put together, I should say, a sequence of thoughts that I had thought independently before, and they began to come together as a result of this conversation. Now, if you want to just study this with me just for a moment, turn back to Deuteronomy 5. Deuteronomy 5 is that reference or giving of the Sabbath commandment. This is really the second occasion in which the Sabbath commandments are iterated, and these are iterated by Moses as God gave them to him. In Deuteronomy 5, the Ten Commandments are laid out in this way. In verse 12, talks about the Sabbath day. Keep the Sabbath day to sanctify it, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work. Neither you, nor your son, nor your daughter, your manservant, your maidservant, your ox, your ass, nor any of your cattle, nor the stranger that is within your gates, that your manservant and your maidservant may rest as well as you. I mean, it's not just that you rest. Anybody for whom you are responsible, anybody who has to work because of you, anybody you make to work or require to work, these people are to be allowed to rest. Give them the time off. And, he says, remember that you were a servant in the land of Egypt, that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and a stretched out arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Oh, okay. So the Sabbath day was commanded to you because you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and he let you go, and it's because of that he commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. And therefore, if you're not an Israelite, this is the argument to win, you don't have to keep the Sabbath day. Now, let's go back to Exodus 20, though, and look at the differentiation that he was making so much of, having to do with the Sabbath commandment. Now, the Sabbath commandment is really a very neat little piece of logic when you look at it. It outlines very nicely, and it adds, I think, to the understanding when you do look at it. It tells you something really very simple. It tells you what you are to do, then it tells you how you are to do it, then it tells you why you are supposed to do it. He starts off by saying, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Now, there's a play on words in here that is lost in most translations. The expression, keep it holy, means perhaps otherwise translated, to sanctify it. There's no real word for keep in here. It just basically, remember the Sabbath day to sanctify it, or, in more common terminology, remember the Sabbath day to set it apart. Because that's what sanctify or to make holy means. It means to whatever it is you've got, you just set it apart from the rest. Now, that's okay. Remember the Sabbath day, he says, to set it apart. How do we do that? Here's the answer. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work. You, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your manservant, nor your maidservant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger that is within your gates. We got all that down pat. I don't even make my ox work on that day. I don't take my ass out to carry a burden on that day. Your dog will do his job normally. You can't stop them from being watchful on the Sabbath day. They are faithful. They work 7 days a week. I will say they do not work very hard, but they work 7 days a week. Now, having told us what to do, he says, set the Sabbath day apart. How then do you do that? Well, you got 7 days here. You take 1 day and you set it apart. How do you do that? Well, you work on those days. You don't work on this day. How simple does it have to get for us to understand it? So you are told to make the Sabbath day holy. Didn't God make it holy? Well, yes, but what you do, and you must, set it apart from the other days by working on those days and not working on that. Otherwise, you haven't sanctified it. You haven't set it apart. You have treated it like any other day. Fair enough? Now then, here comes the why. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and he rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the seventh day and set it apart, as it should read. Now, it says simply, remember the Sabbath day to set it apart. You do this by working 6 days and setting 1 day apart and not working the Sabbath day. Why? Because God worked 6 days and rested the seventh day and set it apart. How did he set it apart? By working 6 and not working the 7th. And so you're supposed to do the same thing. Tell me something. When did God then set the 7th day apart? At creation. Right? Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. If the Sabbath was made at creation, and the Sabbath was made for man, and the Sabbath was made when man was made, then there is a meaning and a significance of the Sabbath day for man. And what we have learned is there is a special meaning of the Sabbath day for Israel. Because they, of all people who were slaves in Egypt and had been made to work 7 days a week, 365 days out of the year with no rest, you of all people whom I have delivered out of slavery and to whom I have granted a day of rest, you should grant your servants and your cattle and your maidservants and all your children, everyone around you should be granted a day of rest. Because as God from the very beginning made man and the very next day gave him the day off, He actually gave us a meaning of the Sabbath for man. And a meaning of the Sabbath was also given to Israel, which was over and above, in addition to and beyond, the meaning for man, not instead of. So if there's an old covenant relationship relative to the Sabbath, the old covenant relationship with the Sabbath is that notation that you, of all people, because you were slaves and I delivered you out of Egypt, should be willing to give the Sabbath day off to other people because of what I've given to you. That's the only aspect of it that is Old Covenant, and Israelite in particular is that meaning and that caution that He gave to Israel at this time. Now, let me take you back immediately to the question then that I raised before concerning the Feast of Tabernacles, because that's what we're talking about. I only digress to that so that I could tell you this, that the Sabbath, that the Feast of Tabernacles is in Leviticus 16 given a very specific national Israelite meaning. Right? Turn back to Zechariah. Zechariah, the 14th chapter. And a lot of people wonder from time to time about this question of camping out at the feast as opposed to staying in motels. And I think the answer to some of that lies in this question of the Old Covenant meaning of it, having to do with the dwelling in booths because of the Exodus and all that was involved in that, as opposed to a significance of the Feast of Tabernacles that reaches out beyond the Exodus or the Old Covenant. In Zechariah 14, behold, the day of the Lord comes, and your spoil shall be divided in the midst of you. Bang. Where are we in prophecy? Anyone who's given it cursory look knows the day of the Lord comes, we're at the end of the age. The end time. Christ is coming back. Christ is going to fight against the nations. It says, I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. When is that, folks? What is the name of that battle? Isn't it Armageddon? We're talking Revelation, book of Revelation, end time, down at the end. He says, the Jerusalem shall be taken, the houses rifled, the women ravished, half the city will go into captivity, the residue of the people shall not be cut off. So you've got a great battle beginning to shape up. And then it says, then shall the Lord go forth, verse 3, and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle. His feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof, toward the east and toward the west. And there shall be a very great valley, and half the mountain shall move toward the north, and half of it toward the south. Now, if you've been down there, you know that has not happened yet. Because the description that we have here is that Christ comes back, plants his feet on the Mount of Olives from which he came, and the power of his return splits the Mount of Olives in two. And the thing moves north and south. A great valley is established, and you've got water that goes to the Dead Sea and water that goes to the Mediterranean from that spot, from that day forward. And we aren't there yet. So we're looking out into the future in prophecy. That's not really that hard to figure. Now, pass down to verse 16. It shall come to pass that every one that is left of all the nations. Now, you should also understand that when we use the term in biblical terms, the nations, it basically means Gentiles. It speaks of Israel and it speaks of the nations. So of all the nations, the Gentiles, which came up against Jerusalem, shall even go up from year to year to worship the Lord, the King, Jehovah of hosts. Now, right off the bat, there's no problem understanding that. God comes back, Christ returns, He defeats these armies, and all the nations, all the Gentiles are going to come up from year to year to worship Jehovah at that place. And to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Whoops. Now, we have suddenly come to something here rather different from anything else you might, or what people would normally have thought about, what people would normally have imagined about this festival. And we have certainly transcended Leviticus 23 and any idea of an old covenant Feast of Tabernacles and the limitations that go with it. We're looking at a time when all nations, and in fact, listen to this too. It says, "It shall be that whoever will not come up of all the families of the earth to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, upon them there shall be no rain. And if the family of Egypt will not go up and come up that have no rain, there shall be the plague wherewith the Lord will smite the heathen who won't come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles." I ask you, is the Feast of Tabernacles going to be optional? Is it a nice thing to do if you feel like it? Is it a good thing? And we probably ought to do it, but if we don't do it, it's no big deal. Well, I don't know. I mean, a drought is a big deal to a farmer. And plagues are a real big deal if you're the one that gets sick and dies. It's significant. There are sanctions against these people who do not keep the Feast of Tabernacles. It's mandatory, folks, when you put sanctions on something like that. Now, what does it mean? And this shall be the punishment of Egypt and of all the Gentiles who don't come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, are the Egyptians keeping the Feast of Tabernacles so that they can remember that they dwelt in booths when the Lord brought them up out of the land of Egypt? Well, hardly. That was the Israelites that dwelt in booths when they came up out of the land of Egypt. Do you realize what we're seeing here? What we are seeing here is that there is a meaning to the holy days of God, and the Feast of Tabernacles in particular on this occasion, that transcends, goes far beyond anything that the Old Covenant or Israel or the commandments to Israel might have ever had to do with it. That there is a Feast of Tabernacles for man, and then there is a Feast of Tabernacles with a significance for Israel that is above and beyond, in addition to the meaning of the Feast of Tabernacles for man. How hard is this? Are you following me through this? It seems easy enough to grasp. This means that there is a timeless quality to these things that reaches way out beyond the simple time span of Moses, the Exodus, the history of Israel up until the time of Christ, and all of what we tend to refer to loosely, without a lot of understanding, as Old Covenant. And that the passing of the Old Covenant has nothing to do with the meaning of the Sabbath for man. It has nothing to do with the meaning of the Feast of Tabernacles for the Egyptians. And in fact, it doesn't have much to do with the meaning of the Feast of Tabernacles, with the passing of the meaning for Israel either. For their relationship with God has to reach a new plane only in the sense that the law of God will be written in their hearts and their minds instead of in tables of stone or on pieces of paper somewhere. And that's another subject which I won't try to go into at any great length today, but just simply to tell you that the whole world will keep the Feast of Tabernacles, and the whole world will keep the Feast in the millennium. And I think if the truth were really known, the Feast of Tabernacles is older by far than Moses or the Israelites. What will it mean for them? Well, we come to know, this is where your cup of coffee and Sabbath morning challenge will come in helping you to find your way through some of the meaning of these things to try to grasp what they are all about. That a tabernacle is a tent, it's a hut, it's a temporary shelter, and that it actually involves people living in temporary dwellings to remind themselves that they are temporary. Now, if you'll turn back to Hebrews 11, I suspect you have been there already during this festival and one or the other of the sermons that are here because of the themes that have been being developed in them. In Hebrews chapter 11, this is the faith chapter, and we've been, I think, at least 3 on faith so far, and so I'm sure we have covered this. But let me just call your attention to a couple of things in this chapter that might not have been emphasized otherwise. In Hebrews chapter 11, and I'll begin reading in verse 8. By faith Abraham, when he was called to go out to a place which he should afterward receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out, not knowing where he was going. He hadn't got a clue. God says, get up, I'm going to take you to a land that I'm going to show you. Now, Abraham lived in a city of no mean city either, a significant place. He lived in a city, he was at home there. God appeared to him and says, get your family together, load up your animals, get your sheep out in front of you, and let's start moving down the road. I'm going to take you to a place that I'm going to show you that you will afterward receive for an inheritance. And Abraham said, you and me, Lord, got it all together, and he left without any idea of where he was going to actually wind up. Then listen to what he says. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise, dwelling as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. Now, think about this for a minute. Here's a man who the rest of his life lived in tents, never lived in a house again. His son Isaac lived in tents all of his life. Jacob lived in tents all of his life. When the sheep grazed out this area, we got busy. We knock out all the tent pegs. We roll up the tents. We put them on the animals. And we move over the ridge, down the valley, and up over the ridge into another area where there's more grass again. We roll out the tents, put the pegs down, up go the ridge poles, and we lay it all out, get the servants to work, get everybody out, get the animals out grazing. We've moved. And this is the way the man lived all of his life. Now, listen to what it says, though. It says that he sojourned. Now, you know what a sojourner is? It's a traveler. It's somebody that's on the route. He sojourned in, not to, in the land of promise, as though he were a stranger. Now, wouldn't you have thought that we get to the land and God says all the way over this way and all the way up that way and all the way to the north and all the way to the south, this is yours. Settle down. No, he is in the land and he's not at home. That's a strange thing when you stop and think about that. That this man lived in the land of promise, still a stranger, still not at home. And then I think about, I've come to the river at the ending of day, and the last wind of sorrow has blown. And we crossed Jordan into the promised land. And we've gone into the kingdom of God. Abraham did all that, and he still wasn't at home. So that during the millennium, we're still camping out. In the millennium, the Egyptians are going to be keeping the Feast of Tabernacles. What does it mean? It means we're not home yet. And even that is a kind of a strange thought. It's a new realization. It's a hard thing to come to grips with initially when you think about it. Now it says that Abraham lived in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise, for he looked for a city that had foundations, whose builder and whose maker is God. Left the city and looked for a city, but the city was to be a city with foundations, whatever that means, whose builder and whose maker was God. Then verse 13 says, these all, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all died in faith, not having received the promise, but having seen them a long way off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims in the earth. Abraham's life was a confession of faith. It was a confession that he was a stranger, that he was not home, that he was going somewhere, that he was not there yet, that he had yet to make his way to it. And it was called a city with foundations, a city whose builder and maker is God, so that he realized that this life is not it. This is not the point. He was, normally we think of faith as a means to an end. We normally think of faith as what we need to get healed. We need to have faith so that we can get a job. We need to have faith so that our children will be able to get into college, or we need to have faith so that whatever it is that you're having faith for. We generally think of faith as a means to an end. And inevitably, that end is, well, where is it? Isn't it in this life? Isn't it on this side of Jordan? Every one of those ends that we normally think we're having faith toward are on this side of Jordan. But of course, even if they're on the other side of Jordan, we're still not home yet. Abraham's faith reached out further than that. Abraham realized that every problem he had was temporary, because everything was temporary. He also then realized that every solution that he would find to a problem was in its nature temporary, that everything was temporary. So I will solve this problem, and I'll have another one. I'll find a solution to this problem, and the solution that I have applied will be the cause of yet another problem. And so on it goes as we make our way through life. Now, he tells us that Abraham looked for a city that had foundations. Now, I don't know of anywhere to go for that except Revelation 21. Do you? I mean, where else is there in the Bible a city where the foundations are important and significant? Now, this is that fabulous prophecy of the new heaven and the new earth that John saw. Mind you, when John saw these things, he was seeing them in a vision. He was not in the future. God didn't pick him up and move him all those years forward into the future. He was right where he was. He was in vision in his mind. He was seeing things that would take place, but he hadn't moved an inch himself. He said, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God, out of heaven, prepared as a bride for her husband. And the description you'll get later of this city is just mind-boggling. The thing is 1,500 miles on a side. If you've ever looked at the translation of the distances involved, 1,500 miles. That way, you realize it's 1,500 miles about to Los Angeles. That's one side of the city. And the thing goes that way, then it goes that way, and then it goes up the same distance. Up. Now, most of the city, where it is described for us here, is gold. You have any idea of the mass of this thing? Can the Earth rotate on its axis with that sort of a mass in one location, or would it wobble somewhere in the process? It's staggering to think about what he sees. This city has 12 foundations, and it says on each of the foundations are the names of the 12 apostles. And then it describes all the precious stones of the visions, and one wonders, really, what on earth is the meaning of all of this? What does it mean? Where is it going? What's out there at the other end of this? And I don't have the answer for that for you today. That's a fun study all by itself, but I'm afraid it's a study that in many cases is going to take you to a dead end, because the opening up of that, I think, is going to be somewhere out ahead of us. He said, I heard a great voice behind me saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them and be their God. Now, that's a marvelous thing to think about, because God is going to dwell with men. That's been his object all along, as a matter of fact, is that he would be able to dwell with men. But there's something there that's troubling. Did you catch it? The tabernacle of God is with men. Now, tell me something. When's God going to ever be at home? The tabernacle is a tent. When he told Israel they were going to dwell in tents and live in tents in the wilderness, God had them all out there. They were all in their camp. They all had their places to camp. He had Judah here and the others, around different places. And God said, I'm going to camp with you. So he had them make him a tent. And he came and his glory filled this tent. It's called the tabernacle of meeting, or the tent of meeting. The tabernacle of the congregation. It's where the Ark of the Covenant was. It's where Korah, Dathan, and Abiram got themselves fried into cinders. Aaron's sons got fried to cinders for coming in and offering strange fire before God. There's a lot of power in there. But God said, I will come, I'm going to camp out with you. Which he did, all through the wilderness. David decided he wanted to build a permanent house for God. And God says, oh, come on. That's not my idea. I didn't want that. Well, he finally allowed them to do it. But all that time, his ark had dwelt in tent, and now we come to the new heavens and the new earth, and God is still in a tent. You think about that. He's still not home. I would have thought new heavens, new earth, new Jerusalem, we'd be home here somewhere. The new heavens and the new earth, has question marks connected with it. Now, the heavens are really quite familiar. Depending on the time of the year, there will be Orion. I recognize that. You'll see the Pleiades. You'll see the Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, and all the layout. You see the Milky Way cutting across the sky. You walk out at night, and that's not there. Something else is there. Different patterns, different formations. Your new heaven and new earth. My word, where have we gone? Are we in the same galaxy? Are we somewhere else entirely? What in the world does this mean? Don't ask me. All I know is there is something here considerably more than I might have ever thought or even considered. Now, where in the world, and what is we going to do is, when is God ultimately going to be at home in all this? Somewhere in time, and I will speak in a figure of speech here, God stepped up to his giant marker board and began to lay out a plan. Now, if you've got a company, a corporation, and you're going to try to lay out your operating plan, you got your gang together to work on all the stuff, you have your board, and you start laying out things along the board so people can read them, and they can all see the same thing and talk back and forth about what's going on. God walks up to the board, and at the top of the board, as any good planner will do, he writes his prime objective. What is our business? What is it that we are trying to do? What is our goal? What is the singular objective of all the things that we are here planning to do? What would you give to know what God wrote at the top of that blackboard? What do you suppose he might have put up there? Well, we can know a surprising amount about it Paul said the invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen by the things that are made. And I will tell you, there's one thing that I can see quite clearly from the things that are made about what he wrote at the top of that board. It was not that he was going to put a third-rate planet around a fourth-rate star, two-thirds of the way out in a relatively insignificant galaxy out here, in which there were billions of stars. And this one little star and this one little planet, and we're going to populate this planet with these little white and black grub worms and yellow blood, all these little grub worms on this planet. We're going to sit there and watch them squirm for 6,000 or 7,000 years. Then we're going to send most of them to hell and maybe even have a few of them turn into something else. It doesn't take a lot to figure out that that's not what's going on here. To me, when you begin to study in the simplest terms, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know this. When you just begin to study in the simplest terms what we know about what God has created, and I don't mean what you see around you here, I mean what you see out there, what we know about that, it is staggering. How many of you people here own a car that you have driven at least 186,000 miles? I wonder how long it took you to do that. Well, now we could get us a brand new van, get some of these kids that got driver's licenses, the young guys that got driver's licenses in here and don't mind beating their bodies to death. Give them a credit card, and a McDonald's gift certificate and put them on the road. And they could put 186,000 miles on a van in about, what do you think? 4, 5, 6 months. Around the clock, you got to sleep. Somebody sleeps while somebody drives. We don't stop for motels. Maybe a shower once a week, something like that. It takes 4 to 6 months. This is the distance that light travels in 1 second. Now, the scope of what we're talking about is this, that the closest star, you go out and find, I forget which one it is, Barnard's star, is it? The closest one out there. You go out in the night sky and you look up if you can find it, locate it, and point toward it. It took 4 years for the light to come to you from that star, traveling at 186,000 miles per second. That's a long, long way, but it is minuscule. The truth is, the Milky Way galaxy of which we are a part, and you visualize a galaxy easily enough, can't you? This little spiral of arms, a little disk of stars that doesn't look, it looks, it's impressive in the pictures and all that, but what they really amount to is not just hundreds of stars, not just millions of stars, but billions of them in a galaxy. All right? They tell us that this Milky Way galaxy of ours, this big disk in the sky, that for light to travel from the one end of it to the other end of it takes 100 million years at 186,000 miles per second. How long has that galaxy been there? For light to travel from one end to the other of it takes 100 million years. Now, I don't know if you know this or not, but you go out there tonight, the moon will not be up early tonight, so you should be able to go out and hopefully see the clear sky. You go out there on a good dark night and get yourself a dark place. But most of what you see up there that look like stars aren't. They are not stars, they are galaxies. Or perhaps globular clusters where there are merely millions of stars as opposed to galaxies where there are billions of them. Now, if you've got a little pinpoint of light over here at a 45-degree angle that is from one side of the galaxy that you're looking at to the other on this little pinpoint, it takes 100 million years for the light to go from one side of it to the other at 186,000 miles per second. And you can look at a 45-degree angle over this direction and you can find another little point of light, which is also a galaxy of the same size, and it takes 100 million years for light to go from one side of that galaxy to the other. What about all this distance in between? From here to there. What's the passage going to be of light from the one galaxy to the other? Well, they tell us that the universe is about 15 billion years old, and that the light, or the information that we can get from the most distant objects that we can reach out there now is around 15 billion light years. 15 billion light years. Now, what puzzles me about this, and nobody's explained this to me yet, if I look this way, there's 15 billion light years away stars that the light arrives at the Earth. If I look this way, I find 15 billion years that way. How come it isn't 30 billion years then from there to there? I don't know. It doesn't make a whole lot of difference, though. Because when you get to 15 billion, you've really gone quite far enough. Quite far enough to establish the point that I'm trying to make to you. Whatever God wrote at the top of that blackboard It is not small. It is no small thing. It is no insignificant thing. It transcends anything you and I have ever imagined. And in fact, it probably transcends anything you and I can imagine. You can know one simple thing. You go out at the night sky and you say, why did God make all that? Well, He made it so it'd be beautiful at night. So we could look up and we could see the stars and the spangles and the Milky Way going across the sky. And we could think how beautiful all this is. The problem is you see a relatively insignificant amount of what was created, so therefore it was not created just for you to look at. The reason behind it goes way beyond anything that you and I can really grasp. Now, I told you all that to come back to the old Feast of Tabernacles again. It does seem, this Feast of Tabernacles, to be about our wretched little 7,000-year history. Notice I used 7,000. Our wretched little 7,000-year history of things that we have been able to run along on this planet, which they tell us is 4 billion years old and has about 4 billion to go, which is not a terribly long time in God's scheme of things, I think. As big as the millennium seems to us, and it does seem big, to me the idea of crossing Jordan, going into the promised land, the kingdom of God, rebuilding the waste cities, beginning to have peace on earth, of being able to put right things that have been wrong for generations of man, to be able to do all that really is a big thing. It's exciting. It's thrilling. We give sermons about it. We talk about sitting under your own vine, your own fig tree, beating your spears into pruning hooks and your swords into plowshares, and all the wonderful things of the millennium. And that they will not hurt nor destroy in all of our holy mountain. Big as it seems to us, the millennium really doesn't amount to much at all in the scale of 15 billion years behind, not counting what there is before, does it? It is not even a watch in the night. It's not even a heartbeat. It's not a breath. It is nearly nothing. Why then? So we keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And it's very important to us. Why? Well, because God said so is good enough. But He's given us this little exercise so that we can make a confession to Him. And our confession is, Lord, this is not home. I'm a stranger. I am a pilgrim. I am looking for a city that has foundations, whose builder and whose maker is God. I'm not just looking for the millennium. I'm not looking just for a time when we can rule for a while and maybe we can do a better job than all the wretched men that have come before us have done. I'm not merely looking for that. I'm looking for a city who has foundations and whose builder and whose maker is God. That little cassette recording that my sister gave me, I was sitting in a parking lot listening to some of the songs on it done by the Old Statesman Quartet. I don't have anything on recording done by my own father, as a matter of fact, which is a great loss to me. But it happened to be songs that my father's quartet had sung. They were. I guess the Statesman had done a special album about the old Stamps songs. So nearly every song on the album was one that was so familiar to me I could have sung it right along with them and sung my part without music. I knew them that well. But there was one song on that when I got to it as I was listening to them. Allie had gone in to get some fried chicken for the Feast of Trumpets in Houston. And I was listening to this song in the parking lot. And suddenly I broke down because I had not heard this song sung by a quartet with all of the memories and the wave of memories that brought back since long before my father had died. Long before. Probably had not heard it in 50 years. This particular song. And all the wave came back upon me, not merely because of the song, because there are other songs there that I had not heard. Now, I'd heard it since then, but I'd heard it in the shower because I was singing it. The memory of it stayed with me. In fact, the memory stayed with me so much that I could pretty well write it down and read it to you, which I'm going to do. I was moved to tears. I was sitting there weeping, listening to it because of the significance of it to me relative to my father and a lot of other people that I have known. I want to read it to you as I close. I will meet you in the morning by the bright riverside when the last winds of sorrow have blown, when we all will be together and be happy for aye, while the years and the ages shall roll. I will meet you in the morning with a how do you do, and we'll sit down by the river and with rapture old acquaintance renew. You will know me in the morning by the smile that I wear when I meet you in the morning in the city that is built foursquare. See you in that city.